Welcome, boys and girls. Christine here with a discussion about the Skaven in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Out of the races in Warhammer 3, I think the Skaven work exceptionally well within the context of the campaign map, though they are not by any means a perfect race. There are certainly some aspects that I think Creative Assembly could improve on them. But there are plenty of benefits with regards to Skaven, but there's also downsides. So they kind of fit that really nice middle ground between being a very powerful race that completely steamrolls the campaign map and a race that's just not really that great to play. Because they have weaknesses. Those weaknesses will cause you plenty of headaches in a campaign. Some things may go too far, but there are plenty of things that are very, very well designed. So for starters, Skaven are a really powerful race in terms of like economic potential, units, but they're widely hated by the vast majority of races on the campaign map. So dwarves hate you, Empire hates you, High Elves hate you. Very few races like you. Actually, no one likes you. Every single race in the game except literally Chaos, and even then, not necessarily all of Chaos, but almost every single race dislikes you to a degree or another. So you're always in this weird situation where you can't really rely on allies all that much. I would also say that Skaven kind of don't feel like Skaven in a certain way from a lore perspective. Like Skaven and the lore are very backstabby, and they're also reliant on masses of units with a couple of specialist units here and there. Clan wars kind of being the exception on that level. But let me explain why is that? Well, for starters, actually succeeding in a Skaven campaign pretty much requires you to not really play with the Skaven mindset. Now, mind you, the Skaven mindset is set to self-destructive in the lore, so I guess it makes sense. But if you're trying to play a sneaky backstabby campaign type thing, you will achieve that in battles, but you won't necessarily achieve that on the campaign map. You need allies, you need to work for that, you need to be reliable, you can't afford losing the reliability rating, and you need to have trade partners, because otherwise your economy is going to take a significant hit. Another thing I would like to mention is that Skaven armies can be exceptionally good. Like these kind of armies that I'm showcasing right here, really, really powerful armies. But the problem is with respect to chaff units in a Skaven campaign. So be it things like Skaven slaves or clan rats, which in the lore constitute the vast majority of the Skaven armies, they're not really worth recruiting in a campaign. Because while they're cheap, their combat ability is severely lacking. Okay, that makes sense from a lore perspective, but the problem is quantity. There is a unit cap that you can bring in battles. Regardless of how many armies and how many units you have on the campaign map, there is a limit on the number of units you can bring in a battle. And, especially on higher difficulties, not only will the AI match you in terms of numbers, they might outright outnumber you. Especially if you're dealing with a siege situation, that can be an issue, or multiple armies on the campaign map that you're fighting at once. So I think I think Creative Assembly did well with the elite unit playstyle of the Skaven, but the problem is that your baseline units, your clan rats, your Skaven slaves, other units as well, they're almost never worth recruiting because you can never feel like the Vermintide, the proper Vermintide. So from my point of view, I think it would be good if Creative Assembly were to add a WAS-style mechanic for the Skaven, but maybe permanent. And we'd have not just a stack of 20 units, but 40 units in every army. And that WA mechanic would just have that WA army or attached army to the principal one would have slots in which we could recruit a bunch of Skaven slaves, a bunch of clan rats. That would actually incentivize you as a player to recruit them as opposed to just recruiting elite units. Of course, this is a nice balancing act, because on one hand, you have these elite units. Your baseline units are pretty bad. Your more elite units are good, but they're also expensive. So you have to balance that out to a degree or another in a Skaven campaign, and that does force you to make choices with the resources you have. And I think that's good, but again, it just doesn't feel like Skaven from a thematic standpoint. And it also creates situations where a lot of units just, again, not worth recruiting. Storm Vermin, Clan Rats, all that. It's kind of sad with Storm Vermin, the elite Skaven infantry. Like, there's very few situations where you can justify recruiting Storm Vermin. I mean, yeah, as Fraught or as Queek, you can, or as Fraught to a certain degree, but even in those campaigns, you're probably better off recruiting some other units, or using Fraud's upgrade system on other units in your army as opposed to Storm Vermin. So I think that's a question, that's something Creative Assembly should look at, the melee infantry situation of the Skaven. Another thing to point out is that Skaven have a lot of heroes, maybe a bit too many heroes. They have a significant amount of hero capacity available to them fairly quickly. So they get chieftains, assassins, packmasters, sorcerers fairly quickly in a campaign. It's a bit annoying with the engineers because you can only increase capacity at tier 5, and I emphasize the bit part of it. It is a bit annoying with respect to that because engineers are flat out the best hero. So frustrating that you have the limitation over there. There's some ways of overcoming it with the Warlock Laboratory for a rite, but still, it's great that you have a lot of heroes, especially casualty replenishment hero, but yeah, limitation on engineers is not an especially great situation, even for the Skaven who can get to tier 5 very quickly in their campaigns, with quite a few settlements relatively quickly. One downside I would say that does exist in their design is the rite system. So dominating scheme, yeah, okay, but pestilence scheme, scheme of doom, 13 scheme, like you look at these cooldowns, they're very, very long cooldowns. They're worth using, but you might use, except like dominating scheme, you might only use these once or twice in a campaign, especially as Skaven, who are a race that excels at aggression. So I think the rites in general, for all races that have them, so the Warhammer 2 race, the baseline races, Tomb Kings, all that, Vampire Coast, they need to be rebalanced overall. I think, instead of Creative Assembly spending their time on control and corruption, they should spend their time rebalancing those, cooldown-wise, effect-wise, that kind of stuff. It's kind of funny, though, to unleash a plague that blows you up as well. Now, one really great mechanic, though, for Skaven is how their settlements work. To a degree. There are some issues here, though. So, when you take over a settlement as a Skaven, it's always going to be tier 1. Doesn't matter if you sack it, occupy it, loot and occupy it. Well, you're always going to loot and occupy it, or sack it, or raise it. Or you can create an undercity. We'll get into that in just a moment. So what's good here is that you don't have that limitation, but you also can use food, which is a strategic resource, to get settlements to any level you want instantly. You still have to construct the buildings individually, but you do have that ability of unlocking a lot of different possible units in a campaign, which makes things really fun and really interesting to work with. There's a couple of issues, though, I do have with the way they handle this. So, first off, the limitation on food early on in a campaign. So when you're playing a Skaven campaign early on, there is a severe limitation on food very early on. There's only so much food you can carry. There's research, and the more settlements you have, the better off you'll be. But it just means even if you stockpile a lot of food, there will be a hard limit of how much you can use it for. I understand it could be considered the balancing situation, but there's almost never any situation in the Skaven campaign where getting a settlement to tier 5 very quickly is not worth it, despite the pain it causes. And there's pain, because it increases construction costs, reduces your income from sacking and looting settlements, reduces your growth. So that is frustrating, but it's not necessarily frustrating in the sense that you have downsides. It's frustrating in the sense that you literally can't bypass this for quite a few times, for quite a few turns. So you have a race that excels at that, and is incentivized to that, but then gets punished for doing what they're supposed to. And I think that's some kind of balancing change that Creative Assembly should work on. Another thing to be said about settlements is that with the Skaven economy, the way their economy works is every structure generates a bit of money. But then you have a significant income modifier over here for arcane generators that can result in your settlements producing a ton of gold. This works, but it also means that your economy is really bad until you get to tier 3. And you're really bad in situations where your settlements are in provinces, or your provinces are not really great economically, far worse than most races in provinces with just one settlement. So Kislev, Prague, difficult battles, especially like Kislev and Ergrad, they're worth it from a recruitment standpoint, but they may not be worth it from an economic standpoint, with the exception of Ergrad, and that's because of the port situation. Tradable resources, pretty substantial. So I think where I would say Creative Assembly needs to balance it with regards to settlements is how the economy works, especially in these provinces with just 1 or 2 regions. So I think that's something they should look at, but overall the settlement situation is pretty good, just those kind of limitations. Another thing to point out about the Skaven is that their research actually requires them to get different buildings unlocked, especially to start researching stuff. And there's a bunch of fluff over here that, takes a long time to actually unlock, takes a while to get these kind of things going, like virulent plants and all that kind of stuff. So I think like the research tree should be overhauled as a whole for the Skaven. It's not bad, but just not really that interesting from my point of view. So on one hand, you have a race with a bunch of really good range units, artillery units, lacking flying, but their melee line not that greatest in the world. You have a balancing act. I would say it works more often than it doesn't, but there is a pretty annoying issue. Auto-resolve. Skaven have one of the worst auto-resolve situations for almost any race in the game as a whole. This comes down to 2 things. One, the armor of units. A lot of Skaven units are not the best armored, even powerful units that you do have available, like Rat Ogres, pretty solid unit, Mutant Rat Ogres. The actual combat capability of armies like this in a manual battle is great. The problem is, when you're fighting a campaign, there's a bunch of, grindy battles. There's a bunch of battles against minor armies or minor garrisons. And as a Skaven, you might be forced to fight these battles far more so than the vast majority of other races. On one hand, it's actually something that can work in your favor because the AI will always underestimate you and think it can win because it's basing it on what it thinks the result will be. But on the other hand, it does get very tedious very quickly and does affect replayability in a Skaven campaign. Finally, I want to talk about Legendary Lords. You do actually have a great selection of Legendary Lords. You have Frot, Ikeclaw, Clinician, some of the best Legendary Lords in the game. Then you have even a generic Lord like Queek is still very, very solid. Skorlk is also a bit more interesting than people give him credit for. Sure, Tretch is Tretch. But the problem is, in these campaigns, while the mechanics are great, a lot of these campaigns end up suffering because of their starting positions. I'm actually surprised that Ikeclaw destroyed Mogre over here, actually. Because you end up in a situation where you're fighting the campaign map instead of working together in harmony with it. So, like, you put Frot's campaign situation on display, for instance. The Kislev cities that he needs to take to literally achieve his campaign victory conditions, they're not really worth it. You could engage in diplomacy, but with the exception of Erengrad, which is actually the only one you want to keep, other cities are in territories that are they're surrounded by other provinces that you want. Like, you want Eastern Oblast, you want Troll Country, right? You want the Southern Oblast. and trading stuff for the AI to potentially get it back can be sketchy. It's not necessarily just an issue of the Skaven, but I think the Skaven suffer far more from this. Like, one of the reasons I have a lot of issues with Ikeclaw's campaign is that you always have this miserable starting situation in Estalia. You can make it work. It can be very strong, sure. It obviously is very strong. But it is always that kind of level of frustration that you're also dealing with, where you're fighting systems as opposed to working in harmony. I suppose some level of jank with the Skaven is an inherent aspect of their race, though I do wonder why Ikeclaw's nukes don't sometimes just randomly blow up Skaven Blight, right? I'm sure he did that at least once in the lore. Or there's probably earthquakes every week in Skaven Blight, or every day, and it's like, oh, what's going on? It's an earthquake? Nah, just Ikeclaw testing nuclear weapons underground, something like that. Let's not even talk about Tankwol's little charades. Let's put it like that. I think that's a bit lacking to some extent. I mean, Front does have that bit of jank, sure, because you can get units that are badly optimized and you need to recycle them. But it's also kind of like a nothing system in a way, because like your armies are strong enough. That's not a problem. Having a unit of a system of individual unit customization sounds great until you realize to really make this work, you need to spend turn after turn getting growth juice and then mutagens and all that. So I think some rebalancing, some improvements across the board to make things work in harmony. Like, because again, you have a very aggressive race. You're incentivized to be aggressive, partly because everyone hates you, partly because of the way your economy works, partly because you can. But on the other hand, you do have plenty of things that not necessarily, I would say, hold you back, but just add a level of frustration and jank to the Skaven experience. And I think that is where Creative Assembly could improve things. But that's my point of view. Let me know what you guys think. Christine signing out. Stay tuned for more.